It's time to close the book on the winter of 2024 with a look at 10 comic books that are coming out of the season with some appeal as I see the market. Some of the top 10 have settled back within their expected value range, finally righting the ship coming out of the comic boom. Others are defying the overall market trend and are creeping up in value, which may soon move them beyond the reach of some collectors. But if you want to know which is which, you're going to have to stick around for my big quarterly top 10 comics list for the winter of 2024. For as long as there's been more than one superhero in a single shared universe, there's been competition between the good guys. Sometimes it's good-natured competitions, other times it can be petty and spiteful. Somehow, over at DC Comics, it took them the better part of 30 years to pick this low-hanging plot fruit before they finally asked the age-old question, who would win in a fight between Superman and the Flash? Or more specifically, who would win in a race between the two? Our number 10 book, Superman number 199, sought to answer that question once and for all. Let's take a step back right quick and cover some good LCS etiquette. Comic shop owners and employees love to talk about comics. It's often why they're in the business, but one of the quickest ways to get on the last nerve of your LCS crew is to bombard them with who would win in a fight between scenarios. This is the comic shop equivalent of walking into a guitar store and playing Stairway to Heaven. You might as well wear white pants after Labor Day. Now, let's switch back over to Superman 199. The issue was cover dated for August 1967 with a June 20th, 1967 release date. Also released on this day was actress Nicole Kidman, who was born in Honolulu on that very same day. The story was titled Superman's Race with the Flash and was presented in two parts. The creative duties fell on some legendary creators, with Carmine Infantino and Murphy Anderson teaming up for the cover art, while the interior was drawn by Kurt Swan. Future Marvel Comics editor-in-chief Jim Shooter was the writer behind this race for the ages. Looking at some recent sales, CGC 8.0 copies are averaging $591 across two sales in the most recent 90 days, which is right in line with the 2018 and 2019 prices in grade. Interestingly enough, the value in grade peaked in 2023 when a copy sold for $1,020 on March 13th of that year. That followed another sale in January of 2023 for $1,000. The value drop between 8.0 and 6.0 is substantial with this one though. So if you'd like a nice copy, but you need to stay a bit below the $500 mark, based on recent sales and neighboring grades, a CGC 6.0 is likely to only run you around $250 right now. As for the race, well, it ended in a tie with one of those cheesy, let's do it together endings. Personally, I'm not a fan of that. Cedric Diggory would still be alive today if it weren't for such sentiment. Next up, we have a late Silver Age Marvel key that has fallen on hard times, even though the character that debuts in the issue is set to take over for one of the big three in the MCU. The number 9 book is Captain America 117. Chances are this is a book you're familiar with because it was one of the hottest Silver Age books out there at the peak of the comic book boom in 2021. Cap 117 is the first appearance of Sam Wilson, who was Marvel's Falcon for decades before picking up the shield as the new Captain America in both the comics and the MCU. Cover dated September 1969, the creative team is strong with this one. You got Stan Lee on the story, Gene Colan on the pencils, Joe Sinnott on the inks. I mean, that's a pretty solid team. Taking a look at Cap 117 in CGC 8.0, recent sales are tracking between 2019 and 2020 prices. The current 90-day average sales price is down to $558 for a book that peaked at $1,599 back in 2021 in grade. Looking at values across the grades, it's all red with the exception of 7.0s, which are up ever so slightly. With Captain America 4 slated for next year, there may be some elevated interest in Captain America 117, especially considering how aggressively the price is corrected. Pre-code horror continues to be a widely popular but price-prohibitive corner of the hobby in 2024. The values in the genre are typically cover-driven, and sometimes just having a big-name artist is enough to drive the price up. This isn't a phenomenon exclusive to pre-code horror or Golden Age. and honestly, even Silver Age or Bronze Age for that matter. But our number 8 book checks both the pre-code horror and big name artist boxes, while remaining on the affordable end of the spectrum. Coming in the number 8 spot is May 1953's Spook number 24. Beginning in mid-1952, publisher Star Comics began to lean into the increasing popularity of horror comics after spending the preceding few years focusing in on crime and other genres. Star had a small advantage, though. It was owned and operated by legendary Golden Age and pre-code horror artist L.B. Cole. Cole's bright, bold colors always make his covers stand out. That holds true with Spook 24's cover. You have this dark and grimy looking mummy offset by bright reds, yellows, and blues. Affordable Golden Age and pre-code horror books are something that I get asked about all the time, and while I wouldn't call this a cheap book by any means, it's definitely on the affordable side. As with most books of the era, comps are fairly few and far between for this issue, but we do have a couple of fairly recent sales to look at with Spook 24. Most recently, a CGC 3.0 copy sold for $336 on March 17th, while a pair of CGC 3.5 sold late in 2023. The first sale was on November 10th for $600, while the second sale happened before the ball dropped on December 31st for a heck of a deal comparatively at just $456. A looker of a CGC 7.0 is coming up for auction on Heritage in late October. I suspect between the higher grade and the timing of the sale during peak spooky season, that one will probably cost a bit more. April and May 1968 was a busy time for Marvel Comics. Many of their anthology or double feature books were wrapping up, and their number of titles was expanding to accommodate the stable of characters that they had developed in the preceding 6.5 years. Of all of these big premiere issues, I feel like one in particular tends to live in the shadow of the others, but not today. For here in the number 7 spot, we're going to give it some shine. Let's talk about Incredible Hulk 102. Cover dated April 1968, the Hulk was given his own title again after spending issues 60 through 101 as part of the double feature found each month in Tales to Astonish, after joining up with Giant Man. Before that character was booted from his own book, beginning with issue 70. Namor cares not about Giant Man's feelings. I mean, what can you say? Despite being the newest kid on the block, when TTA wrapped up with issue 101, Namor was given his brand new number 1 self-titled series, and this was the first time that had happened since the Golden Age, and poor Hulk got stuck with the hand-me-down number from Tales to Astonish. Somehow, 102 feels like the worst of all the new series numbers. Even Doctor Strange's number 169 seems cooler than a 102. Hulk 102 featured the underappreciated talents of Marie Severin for both the cover and interior art, while a young Gary Frederick scripted the story within the issue. He would go on to co-create the Johnny Blaze Ghost Rider in 1972. Looking at recent sales for Hulk 102, there's not really a lot of good news out there for anyone looking to sell a copy of this book, but if you're a buyer, I think you're going to be pretty happy. CGC 9.0 copies are currently averaging sales prices of $542 over the last 90 days, and that's across 6 sales. The most recent sale at $480 marks the lowest sales price for a 9.0 copy since 2020. This is a book that had an average sales price of $873 in 2022. Even the Hulk's King Size Special number 1, which was the annual produced the same year as this fresh start for the Hulk, it overshadows Hulk 102 with a 90-day average value of $715 in the same CGC 9.0 grade. Poor Hulk. In order to stay in compliance with the new 2024 rules for a comic book list, I must now discuss a Dave Stevens book. Thank you for your understanding. Our number 6 book is 3D Zone number 16, featuring the Space Vixens. Published in 1989, 3D Zone 16 is on the higher end of the Dave Stevens covers that are tearing up the secondary market of late. Outside of a couple of lucky buys, or at least so I'm going to consider them, this book has rarely sold for less than $150 to $200 raw in 2024. Most raw sales have been between $200, $300, and even up to $400 per copy. The driving force behind this is the hobby's recent discovery of Stevens' art via a documentary. Now, as somebody who's been a fan since way back when, all I have to say is welcome to the party, everybody. We're glad you finally made it. Pinup style art made a strong resurgence in the 1980s, thanks in large part to talented artists such as Dave Stevens and their love of it from their younger days. Stevens was particularly fond of 50s bombshell Betty Page. He drew a number of comics featuring Page and even used her as the basis for the Rocketeer's girlfriend. Of course, when the movie came out, the character's name was changed to Ginny because Betty Page would have cost money, and it could potentially have brought concerns about the family-friendly nature of this Disney film. 3D Zone 16's publisher, Renegade Press, and a vast number of other independent and small press publishers really embraced pinup and bombshell-style art, and they did pretty well doing so. Oftentimes these books would contain a couple of short stories at the most, but a good chunk of the book, and in some cases all of it, would be devoted to full-page pinup-style illustrations. Prices are jumping hot and fast on a lot of these popular Dave Stevens books, and 3D Zone 16 is right there with them. The 90-day average for a CGC 9.6 copy is up to $562, but the most recent sale of a CGC 9.4 comes in at $500. Which is no doubt going to put some upward pressure on the next sale of a CGC 9.6. Going back to 2020, nobody had ever paid $1,000 for a copy in 9.8 of this book. In 2024, we've had 3 9.8 sales, one at $19.50, another at $22.50, and most recently, a sale for $2,500 in 9.8. If this is a book that you want for your collection, I would recommend one of two courses. Either get out there and dig for a raw copy, because these things are not particularly rare. They've just kind of languished in the naughty boxes in the back of the LCSs for decades, and they're just waiting to be discovered. Or you can wait this fat out and catch a copy on the rebound in a year or two when the market has found its new flavor of the week. Bottom line on these things though, sex sells, and right now, everybody's buying. Speaking of bombshells, let's hop back to the Silver Age and talk about the first cameo appearance of one of Marvel's leading ladies in Amazing Spider-Man number 25, our number 5 book. With Spider-Man, Marvel had a great thing going, but problems were on the horizon. The character's 2 co-creators, Stan Lee and Steve Ditko, were each trying to take the character in their own direction, and it was only a matter of time until the situation went critical. If you're wondering what that has to do with ASM 25, I'm glad you asked. Ditko, for all the credit he rightfully gets and deserves, he has a major flaw as an artist. He could not draw an attractive female character if his life would have depended on it. So for this exercise, Rob Liefeld is to feet as Steve Ditko is to aesthetically pleasing ladies. It seems convenient that Mary Jane Watson would have 2 cameos in the Ditko era, here in issue 25 and then again in Ditko's final issue, number 38, but she would not make her first full appearance until ASM 42, the 4th issue of ASM drawn by jazzy John Romita Sr., a guy who cut his teeth in the 1950s drawing romance comics. When her face was finally revealed, she was the red-headed jackpot that we all know today. But MJ's first cameo isn't the only notable happenings in ASM 25. We are also introduced to the Spider Slayers and the mad scientist behind them, Spencer Smythe, for the very first time as well. This June 1965 issue has been on a similar trajectory to most Silver Age books in recent years. Looking at CGC 8.0 copies, the record in grade was set at $905 back in 2021, with an unusually strong 2023 sale of $900 just below that. The most recent sale in 8.0 was for $561, which is close to a 10% drop when compared to the current 12-month average sales price of $619. Generally though, most grades below 9.0 have been decreasing in value, with just a pair of exceptions that have shown negligible increases over the 12-month average. The 8.0 is corrected back to where one would expect it to be if the comic boom had never happened, and maybe even a touch below that. It's a classic book with a great yellow background cover, and Honestly, it's a must-have for a Spidey collector like me. In the number 4 spot, we're going to dive back into the black and white indie comics of the early 1980s with Primer number 2. Published by Comico in December 1982, Primer was just what it sounds like. It was an anthology series that would serve as a springboard or a primer for new creators and their creations in the publisher's early days. Debuting in Primer number 2 was Matt Wagner's Grendel, specifically the Hunter Rose version of Grendel. And what good is a protagonist without a worthy antagonist? So also introduced in this issue was Hunter Rose's nemesis, Argent the Wolf. Wagner wrote and drew the 10-page Grendel story within and was also given the cover for the issue as well. Now, over the years, I've heard that Wagner doesn't speak too highly of his work here, despite its importance as the character's first appearances. Rumors of someone developing Grendel for this or that come and go all of the time, and we're now settling into a period where there hasn't really been any new news on the subject for a while. This has had a chilling effect on the book's value, making it a good time to consider chasing a copy down, if Primer 2 has been on your list in the past anyway. Year to date, we've had a total of 6 CGC sales for Primer number 2, so we're working with fairly limited data, but what we can see is that in the 9.0 grade, which has 2 of the 6 sales for the year, we have a 90-day average sales price of only $436. That's a little misleading though, because one sale was fairly strong in January at $500, while the most recent sale on April 9th was for just $372. This feels kind of weak to me, but we don't have a lot of sales above 9.0 to really gauge off of, at least for 2024 anyway. For some perspective, Primer 2 and a CGC 9.0 averaged a sales price of $994 in 2022, with a high watermark hitting $1,450 in April 2022. I mean, man, would it suck to be that guy right now. Unfortunately, though, it happens to the best of us from time to time. I generally try to avoid super obvious books that get talked up all of the time on my top 10s. I don't need to tell you that New Mutants 98 and ASM 300 are hot modern books to look out for. We would all love to have an Action 1 or a Tech 27, but most of us never will. So why go there? However, from time to time, there's sufficient reasoning to bring up a book, and we're going to go there today for such a book. Coming in at the number 3 spot is Silver Surfer number 4. This February 1969 issue is on almost every collector's shortlist of all-time favorite Silver Age covers, and anybody with functioning eyeballs can really see why. John Buscema's cover is one of the most dynamic hero versus hero covers in the history of comics. I mean, why restrict ourselves to just saying it's one of the best covers of the Silver Age? It's that good. With Silver Surfer related news coming out of Disney recently, there's been a spike of attention for a number of key Silver Surfer issues, but particularly in the lower and mid grades, Silver Surfer 4 is still well priced when you look at the 90-day average sales prices versus their longer term 12-month or even 2023 average prices. Looking at the CGC 5.0, as it has the highest number of sales in the mid-grade spectrum, the current 90-day average is down almost $100 from the 12-month average price of $621, with the 90-day coming in at $522. The 2023 average in grade was $715. The 2024 sales range in price from $444 on the low end to $695 on the high end. The most recent sale on April 5th was for $560, while the 4 sales preceding it in March and earlier in April were all between $455 and $488. A book like this one is most likely never going to zero. As many as there are, demand is always going to be there. Watching the market and timing your purchase with the dip is the best way to add a book like this to your collection when you're ready. Batman has the best rogues gallery of any comic book hero there is. The only character that could even begin to challenge Batman in that category is Spider-Man, and as much as I love Spidey, credit where credit is due, the Bat takes this one. The bummer is that so many of the well-known classic villains debuted all the way back in the Golden Age, and their first appearances are pretty hard on the wallet. In a couple of instances, we do find a villain that has had multiple versions, though. The first one that comes to mind for me is the Mad Hatter, but that's mostly because I've been on the lookout for a copy of Batman 49 to pair with my Detective 230 recently. The other villain that falls into this category is Clayface, and for the number 2 book, we're diving into Detective Comics 298, the first appearance of the second Clayface. Basil Karlo, who was the original Clayface, debuted all the way back in Detective Comics number 40 in June 1940. But the character would make just a couple of appearances before other villains such as the Joker and Catwoman, the Penguin, and Two-Face would overshadow him. Jump ahead to the early days of the Silver Age, and Clayface returns. But this time, the man in the mud is Matt Hagen. This version of the character more closely resembles the Clayface us 90s kids know from Batman the Animated Series, as Hagen's Clayface is a shape-shifting mud monster. Though the animated series version of Clayface is actually a bit of a mashup of Hagen and Karlo, having Hagen's name and abilities, but the backstory of Karlo. Detective Comics 298 was cover dated for December 1961, putting it on the stands between the release of Fantastic Four number 1 and Fantastic Four number 2. If you were a kid buying comics when this thing came out, you won the space-time lottery for amazing comic books. Sheldon Moldoff drew the cover and interior art for the Batman story, which was written by Bill Finger, the guy responsible for most all the awesome stuff that we associate with Batman today. Recent rumors regarding a potential Clayface appearance in the upcoming sequel to the Batman has caused Tech 298 to get a bit more attention than it normally does. I wanted to feature Detective 298 here because it feels like a book that's on the verge of pricing out the average collector in the near future. Unlike most of the Silver Age books I've talked about on the list today, there's a lot of green in the analysis page for Detective 298. That said, I'm also seeing a decent amount of price compression in the lower grades. Sticking with CGC grades that have recorded sales in 2024, the basement for this one is a 2.5, where a copy sold for $400 in January. The most recent sale of a 3.0 earlier in April matched the $400 of the 2.5 sale. A 5.0 sold in March for $735, followed by a 5.5 later in the same month that went for $700. By the time you hit 6.0, the prices cross into 4 figures. For what it's worth, I feel like this is one of the harder Silver Age Batman villain first appearances to track down. I see Batman 181s, 171s, 189s, and all the like all the time. Even the same with Detective 359s. But with Detective 298, I just don't see it pop up that often. But maybe that's just me. Topping the winter top 10 comics list is X-Men number 94. X-Men 97 has been reinvigorating the back issue market since the first episode was released a few weeks back. Thankfully, this renewed interest in X-Men books appears to be tethered to reality a bit more than X-Men books were back in the boom days. If you remember back to the comic boom, X-Men keys like X-Men 1, Giant Size 1, and X-Men 94 were headed for the moon, and they were making some great time. The frenzy has thankfully long since died off, and prices have improved quite a bit for many key X-Men issues. In fact, I was recently talking with a friend who pointed out that current sales for certain issues and grades, as listed on GPA, were now selling for well below the raw values published in the most recent version of the Overstreet price guide. I mean, welcome to the Twilight Zone. As for X-Men 94, it was the first issue of new material published in the title since X-Men 66 was released in March 1970. X-Men 94 was cover dated August 1975, so for nearly 5.5 years, all X-Men readers got were reprints. Following the successful launch of the new team in Giant Size X-Men number 1 in the summer of 1975, and with an up-and-coming new writer at the helm, X-Men 94 was really a rebirth for the fledgling mutants and their flagship title. Artist Gil Kane provided the cover pencils, while the interior pencils were provided by Dave Cockrum, who also handled the cover inks. Now, this hot new writer I mentioned was none other than Chris Claremont. That's a name that would be associated with the X-Men for decades to come, and one of the most prolific writers in the history of comics. X-Men 94 was just the second appearance of the new team, as well as the second appearance of several well-known characters like Nightcrawler, Storm, and Colossus. Wolverine also made his third full appearance behind Hulk 181 and Giant Size number 1. Let's take a look at some recent sales. Focusing in on the CGC 7.0 grade, there have been 6 sales in the most recent 90 days, with an average sales price of $591. The most recent sale of $450 was actually the lowest sale of the year, as well as the lowest price realized since 2020 in grade. At its peak, a CGC 7.0 copy sold for $1,900 in April 2021. You can go up in grade to a CGC 8.5 and squeak in just below a $1,000 price tag if you've got a bit stronger of a budget. But one thing about X-Men 94 that doesn't really come up too often is how tough this book is in a 9.8. Out of a total of 10,307 copies on the census, only 45 9.8s have been certified, with none grading higher. That's just 0.4% of the total graded copies. So if you can be the first to get your 9.8 through the 9.9 pre-screen successfully, I mean, enjoy your private island. You're going to be set. Giant Size X-Men 1 does tend to get a lot of love, I mean, and rightly so. But don't overlook X-Men 94's importance. If they didn't stick the landing on bringing the new team back over into the main X-Men title, where it could grow into the powerhouse that it became, the 80s and 90s may have been very different for a lot of us. It's been a struggle, but we finally made it through the winter top 10 series. Behind the scenes, things have continued to be crazy around here, and while it may not look much different on the screen, I recently completely upended the studio here and have built it back with some new improvements, and I have a few more in the works for later this year. My ultimate goal is to make it easier for me to just come in, sit down, and get some content made for everybody, and to have some continuity between the pre-recorded videos and live streams. And while I'm not quite set up to stream from here just yet, we're getting really close to that though, and it'll soon be a reality. Beyond that, the back half of April is going to be quite the ride, as I have the second Como comic book show coming up here in Columbia on April 20th, and then the following weekend I'm heading up to Chicago for C2E2 and the King County Toy Show. It's always nice when you can get that 2-for-1 deal out of a road trip, so I'm looking forward to that. On a more serious note, there's been a lot of wild stuff happening in the hobby and the community recently, which unfortunately seems to be becoming a sad new normal for us. The amount of outrage and divisiveness circulating isn't good for us as individuals or for the hobby as a whole. In a time where we need every newcomer to the community that we can get, it's turning into the asshole Olympics out there in the comment sections, chat boards, and even here on YouTube. It's no secret that outrage is good for clicks. It's just the sad reality of the situation. But sooner or later, when everybody gets sick of this shit, all you're gonna have to be mad about is how nobody collects comics anymore. Don't forget that this is supposed to be fun. Remember what brought you into the hobby in the first place, and let's spend more time chasing that than worrying about what CGC or CBCS or whoever is doing this week and how or what somebody else collects. I'm happy to report that we have very few of those issues here on the channel, and I really appreciate you all for the good vibes that you bring with you. Thanks for sticking with me this far. If you enjoy the content, be sure to subscribe and click the like button. The algorithm really loves that stuff. Collect responsibly, and I'll see you in the next video.